So today I wanted to do a few words on owning a trials bike to improve as a trail rider and as an enduro rider. This video is not about what trials is or what observed trials is or even really what a trials bike is. Um, just really quickly, a trials bike is effectively a effectively a BMX bike with a motor. It's not exactly that. I mean, it's effectively a very simple motorcycle that is designed for slow speed maneuvers, and you can learn a lot more about trials bikes. But the point is that trials bikes are they're an awesome tool for learning um, proper motorcycle control. And yeah, this commentary is really about my experience owning a trials bike since 2009 and how I think they can really benefit you in becoming a better rider. So I have some notes here. I'm going to try to be a little bit more structured today, but so here I go. So what's my experience with trials bikes? So I started. I first probably saw my first trials bike in person in 2005. I had a friend who had some property, and he was a pretty good rider at the time. And he just I went over one day, and he just started riding it, and I was kind of like bewildered and confused and really kind of entertained. I wasn't It wasn't until 2009 that I decided, hey, I'm going to try buying a used trials bike to see if I can get better and to learn a little bit about that and a little bit about that experience, right? And so I did. I bought a used gas cast trials bike, 280 TXT, a two-stroke, and I played around with it a little bit. It was really awkward at first, and then I joined a kind of local group in the Portland area, and they were super accommodating and friendly. It was like a really inviting, awesome experience to learn trials with them. I just wanted to maybe meet some people and do a couple of observed trials to see what that was like. And I did that. I did a couple of observed trials, and what I took away from that was a couple things. It was trials is hard. That's the first thing I took away. And the second thing I came away is I didn't really want to be a trials rider. I wasn't interested in spending my Saturday and Sunday competing at trials. I just really wanted to practice a lot and train a lot and ride my trials motorcycle a lot. Unfortunately, at observed trials competition, you don't really ride that much. You kind of sit around and wait, and then you go for your turn. And so that was okay, but I just wanted to ride more, right? And I didn't want to spend my Saturday and Sunday necessarily kind of waiting around. I rather have spent that time riding my dirt bike and then just try to ride my trials bike, during the week. So my situation, it was a little different, and I think it's important to talk about that in the sense that I had a small space that was perfect for setting up kind of like a trials riding area to practice and to set up obstacles in. At the time I owned a kind of like a commercial warehouse where I had my business, and I had an area that was probably like 40 feet by 40 feet, and I set up some obstacles in front there, and I could have good access to it just because I was there every day, and I did that, and it was awesome. I mean, it changed my riding ability, it changed my perspective on riding, and a lot of it had to do with accessibility. I mean, I could just roll this trials bike out and ride for 20 minutes, 40 minutes during lunch, and get a ton of practice in a very small area, with in a very accessible way, right? So in that way, it was perfect for me. I didn't buy a trials bike and only touch it on the weekends. I was pretty fortunate that I could ride during the week for short durations, and so I'll speak a little bit more about that later because I do think that's critical in being successful in like using a trials bike to get better. But that was my situation at the time. Um, Really quickly, you know, why are trials bikes so awesome? Why do I think they're an invaluable tool for getting better with a full size bike? Well, I mean, really, they're small and they're quiet, so you can have possibly you can access them much more often than a full size dirt bike, right? Whether you can ride them in a small space or you can ride them in a tighter area. Maybe you can ride them in your backyard if you have enough space and some distance to your neighbors. I mean, they are pretty quiet. They're about as loud as a kid's quad. and you don't really rev them very much, so they really don't make that much noise. So I think the nature of them makes them accessible to ride in small areas. They're, they're awesome. I mean, they teach you a ton about control. I mean, the way they're laid out and the way they force you to use your lower body and your body movement to do what the motorcycle needs to do is unlike a full-size dirt bike. I mean, you could maybe get a little bit of that on a smaller dirt bike or a kid's bike, but really it's not the same thing, right? Because trials bikes have full-size wheels with a small light chassis, and there's no other bike that really lets you do that. And then there are, a couple more things. They're easy to crash, and I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But so trials bikes are designed so you can jump off them, and that's one of the reasons why they don't have seats. And it makes it awesome because you you learn how to crash, you learn how to jump off, and in doing so, you gain a lot of confidence in being able to try something and then kind of bail if it's not working out. So they're easy to crash, and they're also easy on the body. I mean, they don't weigh very much. You're never going fast, so it's pretty. I shouldn't say it's hard to get hurt, but I would say you never take high speed crashes on them. And interestingly enough, a lot of the guys that were really good um, at the group that I kind of joined for a while, they were all ex motocross racers who just got tired of getting hurt, but they still loved motorcycles, right? So, and they were amazing at trials, and it was just cool to see them talk about that experience of just getting tired of being injured with high speed crashes. So yeah, they're awesome. Trials bikes are awesome. I do think you need certain things. You need certain things to be set up to enjoy a trials bike well, and I'll get into that. Um, but before I do that, I want to get into the top excuses that I hear for from guys that I think really could benefit from a trials bike, but they're not quite ready to go there yet. So the first excuse I hear a lot is, well, I'll just practice trials type stuff on a small bike, a pit bike, or a kid's bike. And like, I mean, I admire the idea, but it just doesn't work. I mean, those bikes are not designed to do trials type hard obstacles, and they just don't work right. And ultimately, what happens is guys that try to do that, they either um, get frustrated because this second bike that they have for this type of riding just breaks or doesn't work well, or is a second bike that's half broken and it just doesn't work well. I mean, I think it's an attempt and maybe it's a solution for some people, but it's really not. I don't think it's worthwhile. So I'll just say that. Um, the other excuse I hear a lot is, yeah, trials bikes are weird and they have no seats. It's like, okay, yeah, great. So get over it. They don't have a seat. There's a good reason for that. And, if in 5 hours of riding, you'll realize why they don't have a seat and why you don't want a seat and why you don't need a seat for this type of riding. Um, and yeah, having no seat is great. You can jump off and you don't need it. So. The other excuse I hear a lot is it's like, well, they're slow and boring. And it's like, okay, no, they're slow and they're hard. Okay, they're not motocross bikes. And if you're the type of guy that just wants to pin it in fourth gear, maybe trials isn't for you. I don't think there's a lot of crossover between trials and motocross specifically, but they're not easy. And riding a trials bike well is hard. And guys that ride well, um, especially at slow speed, they probably all had trials bikes at some point. And I can't tell you how many times I've been completely humbled by guys that have trials bike experience on the trail. Um, the next excuse I get is, I don't want to be a trials rider. I don't want to wear tight pants and I don't want to wear a silly helmet. It's like, well, that's fine. I'm not a trials rider. I don't have any of that stuff. And I've owned a trials bike for, 11 years. And uh, I use a trials bike as a tool to get better as a motorcycle rider. So you don't need to be a trials rider, to own a trials bike. And you don't have to become a trials rider when you own a trials bike. You can just see it as a tool to get better and learn something that you can't learn on another bike. So yeah, then the final excuse I get is well, I can't afford a second bike. And I gotta say, if you're watching this video, you probably have, I don't know, 3 project bikes that are like doing nothing in your garage, doing nothing in the sense of making you a better rider. And yeah, I don't know, get rid of one or two of those projects and buy a used trials bike. I mean, the first trials bike I bought was $3,000 and it was in good condition. I mean, I eventually broke it, but it didn't break because of the condition it was. It broke because I broke it. And then the current trials bike that I have, I bought in 2012, and it was like lightly used by a pro, and I paid, I think, $5,800 for it. And I still have it, and it's in perfect condition. Trials bikes don't really wear the way a dirt bike does. They don't. They kind of run forever. They're almost indestructible. They require very little maintenance, and they're really simple. And so, yeah, I mean, put together $3,500 and buy a trials bike. And worst case, you just resell it for that much. And then the last excuse I get is, oh, well, I don't need it. I'm pretty good. It's like, well, okay, maybe you are that good. Probably not. And I guess guys like that, maybe they just don't want to get better, right? And so if you don't want to get better, maybe this video isn't for you. So, yeah, so those are the top 6 excuses, and there's more, but I won't go into it. Okay, so what's my argument for owning a trials bike, right? So I think I talked a little bit about the first one is accessibility, right? So for me, I had a small space available to ride. Now, it wasn't a space big enough to ride a full-size dirt bike. Not only was it not big enough, but you couldn't really do anything interesting in that space. But I'll tell you what, it was amazing for a trials bike. Again, it was like 40 by 40, maybe 50 by 40. And that's like, I spent 2 years riding in that small area, like during lunch, and it completely transformed the way I was able to ride a full-size dirt bike. And that's all you need. I mean, and there really is no other type of bike that lets you do that. Okay. Maybe a trials bicycle, but that's so different than a trials motorcycle. I don't know if would even go there. Yeah, what I call rider dynamics. So because trials bikes are so light, the input that you put into the bike with your body is so much more obvious, right? Because your body weight makes up such a larger proportion of the total system, right? Versus a dirt bike, you really get to see how your body movement affects the handling of the motorcycle. And you can't get that with a dirt bike, at least not a full-size dirt bike. So pretty awesome. The third thing, which is huge, is on a trials bike, you're always on the clutch. Like you never like take your finger off the clutch, right? And uh, it's huge. I mean, it's huge. Clutch control is huge for obviously applying power, but it's also huge for like cutting power when you need to. And it's also huge for maximizing traction, right? So on a trials bike, you have to learn that skill, which is absolutely invaluable. And then I would say number 4 is, a trials bike demands you to stand on the pegs, right? There's no seat. You have to use your lower body to manipulate the bike and to do what you want to do with the bike. And that transfers directly over to a big bike. I mean, I think, before I had a trials bike, I mean, I was good enough to do a lot of standing on a dirt bike and ride it well. But I would have to admit, I always felt more comfortable sitting than standing before I owned a trials bike. And I would stand because it's the right thing to do. But after riding a trials bike, like after owning one, it felt weird to sit down. Like whenever I sat down on a dirt bike, I felt uncomfortable. And my instinct was to stand on the pegs. And so it's just amazing how your body and your mind adapts to that style of riding. And it's funny because I actually had to go back and learn how to properly sit on a dirt bike in certain situations, like aggressive turns, and untrain my brain to want to stand all the time. So, yeah, standing's great. It's not the end all be all. I mean, definitely like learning how to ride a bike standing is the right technique, but it's not the right technique all the time. So, anyways, the trials bike will definitely teach you how to stand and ride, which is like huge, right? Okay, so yeah, so what will a trials bike do? I mean, obviously, it's going to teach you how to ride slow and technical. It's going to teach you about body position, like what happens when you lean forward, what happens when you come back, and yeah, that's huge, and that goes right over to a big bike. It'll teach you all about throttle control, clutch control, mistakes you make with the throttle, mistakes you make with the clutch. Way easier to make them safely on a trials bike than a full size bike. Although it might not feel that way when you first get on a trials bike, it's actually a safer platform to learn all those things. And then the last thing I think a trials bike will teach you, which I haven't heard anybody really talk about on the internet, is it will teach you how to bail. Like it'll teach you how to bail well when things go wrong. And that's like incredibly important because it gives you confidence to try things that you wouldn't try before. And the confidence is that you know that if things go really poorly, you know how to get off, you know how to get off safely usually, and it's like not a big deal, right? Where on a full size bike, there's just that, especially for novices, there's that fear of getting off and what's going to happen if I come off and am I going to get hurt and is the bike going to fall on me? Well, on a trials bike, you learn how to get off and get off safely, and that just gives you so much more confidence to do things on a full size bike that that you wouldn't think of before. So a trials bike won't teach you anything about riding a bike sitting down, right? And there is a time and a place to ride an enduro bike sitting down, specifically like in aggressive corners and on certain jumps and things like that. A trials bike will not teach you any of that. It won't teach you how to maintain momentum at high speed. Um, a trials bike will teach you slow and gnarly, and um, and it'll do that really well, but it's not the end all be all. I mean, there's lots of other techniques that you need to be a well-rounded rider that have nothing to do with trials. And in fact, it's interesting because Cody Webb, which is a pretty famous hard enduro rider, he talks about how he came from a trials background, and he was a very accomplished trials rider. And then he got into hard enduro, and he wasn't very successful at hard enduro until he learned how to ride on a motocross track, and he learned how to be aggressive at high speed because previous to that he rode everything like a trial section, and it wasn't conducive to being a successful hard enduro rider, right? So again, trials is just a component of being a good enduro rider, and there's a lot of other things to learn, but definitely it'll definitely benefit you in slow and technical, and it'll at least make you much more comfortable in how a motorcycle behaves at slow speed. And so this next section is about what I think you need to get the most out of owning a trials bike. So I don't think I will say here that I don't think every person that wants to get better on a motorcycle should go out and buy a trials bike. I think there are things that will prevent you from being successful in owning a trials bike and enjoying it and getting better as a training tool. So I think what you need to do to get the most out of it is really like you need to approach owning a trials bike initially with an open mind and a lot of patience. I mean, it's vastly different than an enduro bike. What you ride, how you ride, the type of enjoyment that you get is very different. So you have to have an open mind. And so if you don't have an open mind, then you're just going to hate it, or you might not even be remotely interested. And then yeah, just you need to have patience. I mean, it's going to take time. I think once you get the essence of it, it's okay. But early on, it can be a little frustrating. The second thing I'll say is you need to check your ego at the door. I mean, I think that's a trademark of anyone that wants to get better. I mean, I don't care how good of a motorcycle rider you are. If you go to an observed trials and you've never done trials, you will be absolutely humbled by the level of skill that can be achieved on a trials bike. So just leave your ego aside uh, and just get better. Um, And if you can't leave your ego aside, maybe trials isn't for you. So, yeah, so I would definitely say the other thing you really need is I think you have to have access to a small practice area. And what I mean by that is um, I think that's where trials shines. I think as a tool, I think if you have access to an area that you can't ride a dirt bike in, but you can ride a trials bike in, or you can set up a trials course or some obstacles, I think that's really where you'll get the benefit, right? Because um, you'll be able to ride that much more, right? And you'll be able to get better that much faster because now you can ride in an area that you couldn't ride your dirt bike before. For me personally, I went from riding twice a week, right? So Saturday and Sunday to riding 5 more times during the week, right? So I would ride almost every day I was at my shop in that small practice space, even if it was 20 minutes. That made a huge difference, right? I mean, massive difference in my ability to improve as a rider, right? So, and if you don't have that practice area, I think it's kind of hard. And I've seen this happen with some friends. They buy a trials bike and they take it to trails and they're kind of bored and they're kind of frustrated. And then they're just like left wondering why aren't they just riding their dirt bike? And and I think that's, yeah, I've seen people become just demoralized with trials bikes in that way. I really think you need to have like a focus plan for obstacles and a practice routine to really get the most out of a trials bike. It's yeah, it's just not a dirt bike, and I don't think you should treat it like a dirt bike in many ways. Um, yeah, then the other thing, I think you need to know that a trials bike is just a tool, right? And that the skills will transfer to big bikes, to any bike, right? And it's a tool like anything else. It's not an end all be all. It's a tool, but just like any other tool, you need to like master that tool to get the benefit from it, right? Yeah, I would say, you know, I think if you look at the best riders in the world, at least this is just my opinion, the best riders in the world, they are able to seamlessly tie in a bunch of different techniques in their riding, right? And they can tie in those techniques depending on the terrain and the speed that they're riding. And they can switch, between a trials type technique and a enduro type technique and a motocross technique like instantly. And when you see those guys ride like that, and you know what those techniques are, you can identify them and you can be like, wow, that's amazing. He just went from an MX style to a trial style and back, in like 4 seconds. And yeah, I mean, I have no doubt the best riders in the world have a vast array of techniques that they've learned from owning and riding different types of motorcycles and different styles of riding. So, yeah, so kind of on the note of what not to do is, and I say this because I've seen friends that buy trials bikes and get frustrated with them. Is like, don't buy a trials bike thinking it's a second dirt bike. It's not. Don't go ride it where you ride dirt bikes necessarily. I think you'll be annoyed or frustrated. Um, I would use it to complement your enduro bike or your trail bike, right? Um, Ideally, you want to go to an area that's designated for trials riding. And what I mean by that is it has obstacles to challenge a trials bike, right? Um, they're probably obstacles you would not want to ride with your dirt bike. If they're obstacles you can ride with your dirt bike, they're not hard enough, right? So when you buy a trials bike, hopefully you'll find an area where you can go ride trials and get the most out of that. Um, and again, if there are areas where you can easily ride a dirt bike, they're just not adequate for a trials bike. Um, yeah, I would again just to for I think to improve your best chance of success, you need to set up an area where you practice and you ride. And again, you don't need a very big area, but you do need an area with obstacles and specific things to make you improve your technique and just be able to just crank through repetition of technique. So, I mean, I think in summary, like if I think of who a trials bike is for, I mean, a trials bike is for a trials rider, but we're not talking about trials rider. We're talking about enthusiasts who want to get better at enduro riding or trail riding. I would say, you have to be committed at getting better because riding a trials bike is not necessarily easy, at least in the beginning. Um, and you have to be just like willing to try something completely different and willing to commit into having an area where you practice trials and you practice your technique of what trials is. Um, and Yeah, I just think it takes an open mind. I think it takes an open mind, and I think it takes dedication to getting better. So yeah, I think to wrap up my final point, if you're on the fence of getting a trials bike, I would challenge you to think about the following requirement because I think this is the definitive litmus test um, for whether you will enjoy it or not. Um, I think you need to be realistic with yourself uh, and really ask yourself if you have a specific area where you can set up trials type obstacles um, to ride a trials bike, or you have access to an area that has trials type obstacles. Because I think if you don't have that, and you take your trials bike to a dirt bike riding area, I think you're just going to be frustrated, and you're just going to be left wondering why you're not riding your dirt bike. But if you have the space in the area to set up a tiny trials section, you will benefit tremendously from riding trials, and it's absolutely incredible. I mean, the amount of growth that I did as a rider in just having access to that 40 by 40 foot space with obstacles made out of wood and pallets and logs was incredible. And it was incredible because it was it was it was a challenging, you know, obstacle course, and I was determined, but also it was huge because I was able to ride my motorcycle so much more because I had access to that small area and I had access to a trials bike. I think that's the biggest takeaway. So to wrap up this commentary, I just want to say that if a trials bike allows you to ride more and allows you to get more repetition in on riding hard obstacles, it's a no-brainer, right? I think if you're really committed in going to an area that is appropriate for trials, or you're committed to setting up an area with trials obstacles, you will absolutely not regret owning a trials bike, and you'll probably own one well into your old age. Um, so think about that. Hopefully, I shared something useful and I shared some ideas that aren't really out there. And if you have any suggestions or comments, please leave them below. And I'm happy to answer any questions I can help with based on the experience I have. And yeah, good luck finding a good trials bike. You'll enjoy it.